I'm Letha Filderman, the president of PopTech.
And I'm Sarah Kuchesfahani, the director of the N Squared DC Hub.
We'd like to welcome you to season 2 of the Nuclear Mixer series. We really had a great time last year with a number of events, and we really are delighted all of you are with us tonight. And we'll be sharing some information about the date for our next mixer toward the end of the program. Sarah?
Thank you, Letha. Thanks, Letha. Laura, I love that you're mixing a drink already. That's so great. Thank you for doing this. Is the spirit of these nuclear mixers. So as Letha said,
wasn't that the point?
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate the fact that you read the invitation. This is great. So welcome, everyone. As Letha said, this is our second season. Obviously, this is another virtual nuclear mixer. We're really happy to see all of you with us here today. Yes, we're sad that we're not in person, but the virtual aspect allows us to be more welcoming and more inclusive of people from all over the country and perhaps all over the world. So we have two excellent speakers lined up for you for the next 60 minutes or so, and they're going to be discussing how to improve diversity and inclusion in the nuclear community, borrowing from best practices used in big tech, startups, and other institutional settings. We have Dr. Marina Robinson Snowden, who is a senior engineer at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and Kelly Mason, the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Notley. These are real two champions of diversity and inclusion efforts, and we are so thrilled that they could be with us today. So Marina and Kelly are going to engage in a discussion, and then Letha's going to ask them a couple of questions before we do what we always do, and that is to break us into mini breakout rooms. This is where we all have to kind of do some work together. But this is exciting because this is where we hope that you will find new acquaintances, new colleagues, and this is where you're going to get to participate, connect, contribute, and reflect on what we've all heard. Then we'll come back after about 10 minutes or so in our breakout sessions, and then we'll share some of our reflections together and some questions before, as Letha mentioned, because I'm such a stickler for punctuality, before we wrap up at 5:30 on the dot. But thank you so much for joining us at A Seat at the Table, which is the name of our mixer. I'm sorry I don't have a drink, but we can imagine that there is some drink in here. So cheers to all of you, and over to you, Marina.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Letha, for first of all inviting me to participate in the discussion and putting me alongside such a giant in the space. I was asked to help describe where the nuclear space is right now with respect to diversity and inclusion. And I thought that we could attack this issue from kind of three sides, right? So the first is kind of how racism manifests in the field. And the second is how we understand diversity and inclusion and talk about it in the field. And kind of what my observations have been around why we've fallen short with respect to progress, particularly as it relates to communities of color, right? So if you all saw in the invitation, Sarah and Letha shared with you a really powerful article called A Call for Anti-Racist Action and Accountability in the Nuclear Field. And that article really provides us a frame to understand the first question of how racism shows up in the nuclear field, right? And what the authors provide us with is kind of two different buckets. You have epistemic racism, which is really what happens in terms of the substance of the conversation, and then what they title institutional racism, right? So who is or is not included. With respect to epistemic racism, this is really targeting the actual work that is done. So the policies that are pursued, the structures that are put in place, how they look, who is represented or not. And then also more fundamentally, the lens through which we look at these issues, right? So on the substance of the work, it's really asking the question of how institutions of systemic racism or systemic oppression, whether we're talking about colonialism, Jim Crow, racial hierarchies, how they intersected and intersect today with the policies that we're putting in place around nuclear security, right? So whether we're talking about nuclear weapons testing, where the testing happened, who got compensation and who didn't, right? Whether we're talking about, non-proliferation policy, who should make these decisions and who was left out. These are really kind of the way in which racism shows up in the substance. In terms of the lens, there's really been a dominant frame in terms of a national security frame, way of defining these issues. And that frame really centers the state as the primary object, right? And the idea is that they define threats in that national security frame as external to the state, right? And what you can see rising in the discourse as it stands now is there's kind of a tension with the way that we have kind of previously framed these discussions around national security and the community feeling like that's inadequate, right? So prioritizing the state, they don't feel like is adequate, right? Defining threats as external is inadequate. And what you see is people trying to introduce a new frame, something called human security, right? This idea of how can we bring in concepts of justice and equity and economics and humanity, right, into how we prioritize and pursue our policy goals. And not center the state so much, but center the humans and those who would be impacted by those policies as a way of prioritizing the way that we move, right? So that's the epistemic piece, the substance of the work. Then there's the institutional piece. Who is and is not seen as a credible voice, how you have to present yourself in the space, the language that you use, the way that you physically present yourself in the space. And there are some mechanisms that work to enable this institutional racism. And two of the mechanisms that the article calls out is, one is gatekeeping and the other is microaggressions, right? And there was another really powerful article by Kelly that talks about the intricacies of microaggressions that I recommend you all check out, right? But the gatekeeping piece is pretty obvious, right? Who holds the keys to the discourse? Who is dictating the rules of engagement, the terms of engagement, right? And then with the microaggressions piece, it's really death by 1,000 cuts, right? So it's the gaslighting, making people feel like they're crazy when they have experiences with racist, racist interactions. It's censorship, right? It's othering folks that are in your community. All of these mechanisms work together to enable that institutional racism that the article so eloquently describes. And for me, I think those mechanisms also play a role in the way that this field has traditionally talked about diversity and inclusion. And I don't know if you all have noticed this, but there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between the way that D&I is discussed kind of theoretically, right, through solidarity statements, through press releases, and then what's actually happening practically on the ground, right? When you look at the institutions, who's in leadership, who is staying, who is going. And I think that there are some key ways that those mechanisms of gatekeeping work to negatively impact that discourse. But before we talk about the discourse, it's really important to understand that diversity and inclusion work happens kind of in two main spaces. You have the recruitment work, and that's trying to get people into the field, trying to get them in the door. And then there's the equally important other side of the coin, which is the retention work, right? So once you have those folks in your community, how do you keep them and also advance them through the ranks, right? And the reason why I call out the gatekeeping mechanism as kind of an obstruction so far in the way that we've been able to have the conversation is, whether we like it or not, the configuration of the field at this moment still is such that the leadership is predominantly white and predominantly male, right? So when you're talking about at an organizational level, the types of conversations that you are able to have around representation, around culture, around how the corporate culture is experienced by your staff is still to some extent filtered through the lens of the leadership, right? So this is where the onus comes in on those leaders to do their work, right? So the level of the discourse is almost proportional to the developmental age of the leadership with respect to diversity and inclusion. So if you are uncomfortable as a leader talking about root causes, talking about issues like white privilege and white supremacy, right? If you don't allow a space in your organization to actually discuss how those concepts and how those forces interact with your company culture, then you are the obstacle to the progress that you want to see in the world, right? So that's the second issue. But I think that outside of the gatekeeping and the microaggressions, I feel like some of the work that we've done over the past 30 years in trying to bridge the gap with respect to gender, with respect to particularly communities of color, the intentions have been good, right? Generally speaking, but the implementation has been incomplete, right? Because we have not had a full enough understanding of our toolbox. So the way that we've gone about describing or designing these interventions, right, these initiatives, these programs to close the gender gap, to close the ethnic and racial gap, right, they've really taken a view of a one size fits all, right? This idea that we want to design our programs to reach as many minorities as possible, right? And where that makes sense from a scalability argument, right? You have limited resources, you want to make the most impact. What you're doing is you're diluting the distinct lived experiences and thus distinct needs that each of these communities have, right? So African Americans face a different type of racism than, for example, Asian Americans, right? Particularly in COVID, there are very different and distinct experiences. And how can we build and design our system and our interventions to honor that, right? And actually to provide targeted progress. Additionally, we have been overly reliant on what I call preventative measures at the expense of proactive measures, right? So if you listen closely, a lot of the initiatives that people put forward are what? Unconscious bias training. Let's get everybody in a room and let's talk about how not to be unconsciously biased, right? And that sounds good on its face, but functionally, it works more to protect the organization from liability, right? To that you train your staff on this, so please don't sue me, than it does to propel any one single marginalized group forward, right? So we have to be able to think about not only the issue of epistemic versus institutional, but also the toolboxes that we have and what different tools we can leverage to try to get after this problem. And this is why I'm so excited, me myself, to listen to Kelly, because she has those best practices and that strategic view on how industries across the board have approached this problem. And I'm going to turn it over to her to give us all these nuggets of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina. That really fired me up. I'm like, yes, like, let's talk about it. Though I will say, you handed it over to me, and I have over a decade of experience working in diversity and inclusion, particularly in the tech space. So startup, Silicon Valley, that was kind of my world for a while. I'm in Austin now, but still working in the startup and tech scene. And there are best practices, but there's no, silver bullet. And I think what Marina was mentioning about there's not a one size fits all. And a lot of people are looking for this, like, Kelly, just tell me what to do. We'll do it if you just tell us what it is. And I'm like, it's not that easy. And I appreciate the passion and the intentionality of people who do want to make the change. The problem is a lot of times the change is harder than you want. You want to just say, we'll post this job post and we'll get 20 Black candidates and they'll all be great and we're done. We've solved it. It's not that easy, but there are things you can do. So I'll go into, over the next few minutes, I'll go into the things that you can do, things just top of mind that have helped in the tech industry. And I'm saying help because, again, it's not like the tech industry has solved this. No one has solved this. This is so multi-layered, right? It goes back to things like Marina was saying about white supremacy and privilege and these very intractable issues that go much, much deeper than just workplace inclusion. But at the beginning, at the root of that is that intentionality. And I think, a lot of your organizations have probably signed that solidarity statement that Marina mentioned. And I wonder what percent, and I'll ask Marina this, but also just, have everyone on the call reflect for their own organizations. Is there a true commitment to making a change? Or is it just, the public pressure of needing to sign on to this, the kind of PR move? So think about the intentionality. Think about the intentionality of your group and call it out. If you're in a leadership position, question yourself, evaluate your own reasons for signing on. And if you're not in a leadership position, use your voice as an ally to call them out and to say, what's the intentionality? Are we actually demonstrating that we want things to change? Or are we just signing on to this nice statement of solidarity, right? It's kind of like, thoughts and prayers are great, but they're not going to lead to racial equity. We've had those for generations, right? Who would think in 2021, this is where we would be after the 1960s and the civil rights movement and the progress that we made then? So start with intentionality, question your organizations, question, is the intentionality really there? If it is, then you move on to specificity. And this is what Marina said in her article, you can't just have the will, right? You have to find out what the way is. So that's specificity. That's getting into what does goal setting look like in your organization? So in the tech industry, you can't do anything without setting a goal. We set goals for customer acquisition, cutting down tech debt, every single thing that the company's leadership thinks is going to be important to the company's success that quarter or that year, they're going to set a goal around it. They're going to say, you know, we've got objectives and key results, we've got KPIs, we've got all these things. What are the goals that your organization has set? Think about how you're going to set goals. Hold yourselves accountable, right? We've made the statement, we've said we stand in solidarity, we want to see racial equity in this space. What's the next step? What are you doing? How do you want next year to be different so that you're not just making this statement again next year? Once you've set those goals, look at proactivity. So what are you doing to achieve those goals, right? In the tech space, that I think two of the easiest things that I've seen work that again do not cost anything, because I know a lot of organizations are nonprofits and don't have, you know, Google budgets or Facebook budgets, or even, you know, Series C startup budgets. It's look at who are you bringing into the fold. So one of the things that Marina and Sarah mentioned when we were talking before this, you know, in preparation for this conversation, was that unpaid internships is something that's very popular in the space. If you look at, again, that deeper level of what's going on in this country, what's going on in the world, who can afford to work unpaid internships? It's people who have familial support, who come from higher socioeconomic statuses. Instantly, you're going to see that that pool is going to trend wider. So you're going to have more white kids who are able to take on unpaid internships, who are able to even apply, right? So when you're like, oh, we have this internship opportunity, but no one's applying, you know, I can't get any Black people to apply. Let's look at this, let's peel back the onion, right? Let's look at who can afford, especially in a city like DC, to live without getting paid. And so one thing that we've had success, and similarly like in Silicon Valley, no one can afford to live in Silicon Valley without getting paid. And Austin is turning into that too. I mean, it's a problem throughout the country, but one thing that has been really successful is partnering with universities and doing course credit. So, you know, I don't know where you guys are in your organizations, but reach out to, especially if you're in DC, there's a ton of historically Black colleges and universities. Reach out to them, find a partner who's able to connect you with students who can get compensated in course credit. So they can still be your interns, they can enter the nuclear community, they can see that the nuclear community is embracing them and wanting them, but they're also not worried about how are they going to pay their rent if this is, you know, their full-time thing. The next thing, it's kind of the inverse, right? Look at colleges, that's a huge pool, especially HBCUs of diverse talent. Work with them to provide course credit in exchange for internships so that they're able to benefit you and get their foot in the door. The flip side of that is don't look at colleges. So another issue that you know kind of surfaced in our discussions around the nuclear community and how the nuclear community is engaging communities of color in the talent pool is that apparently a lot of roles you have to have a college degree or even an advanced degree, even if you're not actually using the skills you've learned in that degree in the role. And that was something that the tech industry definitely grappled with, you know, 5-10 years ago. You had to have a computer science degree to get an engineering role. You had to, you know, come from a top 10 university, whatever it might be. But what you see is that, again, peeling back the layer, there's structures in America where because of economic status, because of your college counselor, who they're encouraging to go to the top schools and who they're not. Once you get into a computer science or I'm sure a nuclear degree, who are the professors vetting and grooming and really supporting and encouraging? Who are the professors writing the best letters of recommendation for when it comes to getting that advanced degree? All of these things, these small things, they add up and they compile to, you've got this candidate pool. And when you look at your eligible candidate pool, which, you know, for a lot of roles, people list college degree as an eligibility, you're going to say, you're going to throw up your hand and say like, well, we can't even get Black people to apply. We can't get people of color to apply. We can't get women to apply. But of course, that's not really the case. It's because all of these things that have happened in their educational or personal and familial backgrounds that's kept them from getting those advanced degrees. And so that's another thing that, again, does not cost any money. It's been very successful in the tech space. Google in particular, they are super data driven. They really spearheaded this field of people analytics. And so they've got all of these data points, right, in their employee population. And they can see that they saw at some point that there was no correlation between someone's likelihood of getting promoted and their obtainment of a college degree, whether they had a college degree or not. So after a while, once they figured that out and they were, and simultaneously realized that they were leaving out a huge diverse talent pool by requiring college degrees, they took it away. So even engineering roles, you can get a boot camp degree, right? You can teach yourself. There's a ton of things that you can do to be successful in a role that do not require a college degree. So that's another super successful one. Finally, I think when you look beyond recruiting and get into retention, the other easiest thing you can do is be an ally. It does not cost a dime. It's kind of spending your privilege, right? So what can you do? Can you decline speaking engagements where it's all white panelists? And let them know, let the organizers know, this is why I'm going to decline the speaking engagement. That's been very successful on the gender side in the tech industry, where men have, decided to be allies and say, I'm not going to speak on panels that are all men, or I'm not going to speak at conferences that are all men. And that very quickly changed tech conferences. It's not perfect, but it definitely helped. So that's one easy thing. Giving credit where credit is due. I'm not very familiar with academia, but definitely in the tech space, there's a lot of, people want ownership, right? You want ownership of some idea, but you're not doing anything in a silo. You're working with a team. And so can you find opportunities to give credit to your colleagues and to really mention them and say like, oh, so-and-so did such a great job. That's going to help them feel included. That's going to help retain them. That's going to help them feel like I want to stay in this industry and invite my friends into this industry. Honestly, that's a whole speech I could give about being an ally. I won't give it. It's 2021. Don't be afraid to use your privilege. And, those are just off the top of my head 4 things that y'all can do in your industry. Be an ally, recruit your interns from HBCUs, give them course credit. Don't require college degrees. Mark Zuckerberg can run Facebook without a college degree. I'm sure you can have more hires on your team who don't have a college degree. So I'll turn it over to Letha with that. Thank you so much.
Well, fabulous. I mean, already I think Sarah and I were just kind of mentioning to one another, this is such a captivating conversation. And I think, one that's sorely needed, not just in the nuclear space, but across the board and around the world. And so I would first of all like to thank both of you for being so extraordinarily candid. And it's really an amazing conversation. And we saw Joe Biden appoint I think it is the most diverse cabinet that we've ever seen in the history of the United States. I'm going to just throw one little question out just to get you two going back and forth with one another. So the question is for both of you to almost discuss, particularly in the context of both epistemic and institutional racism. Is that going to matter? Is it leading by example? Does it address the issue of leadership discomfort? So I'm going to turn it over to you two to engage with one another.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and it's a really exciting time on this topic, right? Because we are seeing actual movement, right? And we have to give credit where credit is due. The administration, Biden was pushed pretty hard, right, by interest groups, right, by women of color groups, by, diversity and inclusion groups across the board, that you better make good on your promise, right? That this is a different age now. You cannot just pay lip service to these issues, which has been the historical trend. And to Biden's credit, he did. He has and is making good. And I think that it's to be seen how that intentionality trickles down to the working levels, right? So beyond just the principals, but down to the folks who are going to be actually in the trenches, doing the negotiations, coming up with the policies, because those positions are still largely unfilled, right? So they are still building that team. But I think, substantively, you can see there's already some changes happening, right? So, for example, recently, the Department of Defense just issued a full stop work order so that they could look into extremism within their ranks. How do we deal with extremism and sexual harassment in the Department of Defense, right? I don't know if this has ever happened before. I'm a spring chicken, so maybe, but this is news to me that this is, something that could have been done. So I think, having, Secretary Austin in that position, whether his lived experience as a Black man in the military played a role in the seriousness that he takes white extremism, right? Like white racially motivated violence, that's his story that he will have to tell. But you can see from a policy perspective, he has centered that as important to look at and get a handle on before they move forward with other priorities, right? So I think that's already a demonstrated change.
Yeah, I think the other thing it shows symbolically, but also really, is that the talent is there. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times, people will say, particularly in engineering, that's my field and my space, and software engineering. People will say, well, only 20% of computer science graduates are women, or only 15% are people of color, or Black and Hispanic. And I'm like, okay, well, how many do you need to hire, right? Like, you only need 4 or 5. So I think similarly, like, Biden is showing that the talent is there. If you are going, are women and men at parity? Are people of color at parity with white people in all across the profession, every single profession, every single industry? No, of course not. But is there talent out there? If you're being intentional, like Biden was because of the pressure that was put on him, if you're being intentional about bringing diverse candidates to the table, you're going to find them. They are there. So take that next step and take that intentionality and find them. And don't just say like, well, only 2% of whatever. Okay, why are they at a different company, not at your company? Why are they at a different organization, not at your organization? So I think that to me is the symbol and the message that this sends.
If I could have a quick 2-finger on that, I think to Kelly's point, right? Yes, the talent is out there, and you might need in practice, right? That might mean that you might need to slow roll your hiring so that you can really look, right? So maybe your hiring is not going to take 4 weeks like you thought. Maybe you need to dedicate an additional 2 or 3 weeks to really make sure that you've combed through all of the potential candidates, right? So people and leaders have to be okay with that short-term discomfort, that you may not have that position filled right then and there, to leave room for the opportunity for you to find that really fresh voice and perspective that you say you want, but what skin are you willing to put in the game to actually achieve that, right?
Totally. And going back to goal setting, one of the things in recruiting that was really popular for a while, and I'm sure is still popular at companies I have not reached yet, was having recruiters being evaluated by their time to fill. So how long does it take a recruiter when a hiring manager comes and says, I need a mid-level data scientist? How long does it take that recruiter to find one? And they were being incentivized and rewarded for finding and closing the role quickly. But looking back, peeling back the layer, like we always have to do, that was meaning they were going to the, easy, the usual suspects. They weren't taking the time to find the talent that was there, but just wasn't everywhere, right? And so that's another thing, exactly like Marina's saying, take the time. The talent is out there. There's people who can be successful in your organization. They might not be on your speed dial. They might not be on your friend's speed dial. Take the time, put the intentionality behind finding them. And I love that, right? Like, to me, it's like data and KPIs, and it's like, don't just depend on time to fill, but like also sit with the discomfort of my role might not be filled in 2 weeks. My role might not be filled in 2 months. But when my role is filled, it's going to be with a candidate who's bringing a diversity of perspective to our team that we will hopefully be able to engage for years and years to come. So it's worth that discomfort.
Fabulous. So we're going to get ready to go to the breakout rooms. And, we usually love to have you guys send people off with a little assignment to liven up their next 11 or 12 minutes together. So I'm going to turn it over to you to send us off to the breakout rooms. And then we will all come back in about 12 minutes to do a little bit of Q&A and further discussion with the bigger group.
Okay, so the assignment is, ladies and gentlemen, you have to think about what are you going to do in the next week to increase your chances of bringing a person of color into your organization? Okay, what actionable step are you going to take this week to get after that problem? Go forth and conquer, my friends.
Well, welcome back, everybody.
Letha, would you like me to kick it off with inviting questions? I'm not sure if I introduced myself. My name's Brittany. I work with Tech Change and been managing the breakout rooms in the Zoom call. But I think now that everyone's back, we would love to open up the floor for questions, reflections, thoughts coming out of the breakout rooms. And so we can do this two ways. You can raise your hand using the Zoom raise your hand feature, or feel free to show or to write some questions in the chat for Marina and Kelly. Arturo, if you want to unmute.
Yes, well, this is a wonderful group. Thank you so much, and a pleasure meeting all of you. I actually represent the academia, and I know the academia and universities were used as an example. But I wonder if you have any recommendations specifically for the academic sector and for researchers. I often find that academia is part of the problem. Some of the vices and issues regarding lack of representation and diversity come from the academia itself. And I wonder if you have any good lessons worth applying for the academic sector, where we also have challenges of equity and representation. Thank you.
Kelly, I can jump in and then if you don't mind on this. So thank you, Arturo, for that question. I think there's a couple of things that I feel like academia could do better, right? The first is kind of know thyself, right? So I think one of the most important starting places in DEI work is to get a full assessment of where we stand, right? And my experience in academia is that data is not adequately tracked, right, in a way that can be actionable, right? So is the faculty leadership actually every 2 years, right, when the visiting committee comes, is this a line item on the conversation? Are we looking at what these trends look like and actually measuring and monitoring our interventions against the success rate, right? But I also think that, I'm a nuclear engineer by training, and we have had very interesting conversations around qualifications, right? And the fact that it seems like my observation has been that word only really comes in when we're talking about women and people of color, right? We start to introduce this idea of what we want. They need to be qualified. What do we mean by qualified, right? And this may be unique to nuclear engineering because people come in from a lot of different disciplines, right? People come in from math, people come in from chemistry, X, Y, Z. So you're trying to cognitively make that fit. But what professors and department heads need to recognize is often they're more flexible with their definitions when it comes to majority identity, white males, than they are with minority identities, right? So Black people, people of color, women, we have to check 100% of the boxes in order for you to take a risk on us. Whereas the benefit of the doubt is often given to white male candidates that only have 60% of what you define as qualified, right? So we have to be willing to really analyze and investigate those things that are not like explicitly written down, because often academia does that, right? You don't make policies explicit because it gives you wiggle room, right? You think about the qualifying exam, you think about who's gonna get the PhD or not. Nothing is black and white on a website, right? It's very subjective. So faculty and academics, they have to be willing to investigate and interrogate those subjective metrics that they're putting on folks and making sure they are equitable, and where possible, making them explicit, right? Writing them down so that we can hold ourselves accountable, because it really takes the power away from students of color and women to actually advocate for their position, right? If they don't understand what justification you're using for pushing them out of the field, right? For giving them a master's when they wanted a PhD. Like, you're not allowing them to advocate for themselves because you're keeping everything so mystified. So that's where I would start. Thank you.
We have another question from Nicole. I see your hand raised, Nicole.
Hi there, I'm Nicole. Really enjoyed your talk. I'm actually in charge of diversity and inclusion at a think tank with a 20-some year career in actually non-proliferation and national security policy and law. My question to you is, we're being really forward-leaning in terms of how we're opening the pipeline. But one of the questions that, I see that there's, it's still swirling out there in terms of what the benefit is. And I'm not going to reveal what my position is, but I just want to hear from you. In terms of when you're advertising positions, the usefulness of posting the salary range, right? So a lot of institutions, think tanks do not post any salary range with a job posting. And so, when you're entertaining whether or not to do that, the argument is that, well, if you post the range, then you're going to ensure equity in your negotiation process and, salary equity and all of those other areas. The counter argument is actually no, because at the end of the day, you still have this issue with pay equity within the institution for people who are already there and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering, from the two of you, what you think is the value of posting salary ranges? If there is, what's the value? And if not, what are better ways to get to the objective? Thanks.
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding you correctly, one of the concerns that people are having with posting the salary range is that it might throw off internal equity. Like someone who's already in that role or who's already in a similar role is going to say, why is this new hire making 20,000 more than me? Is that?
That's part of it. Also, in terms of the objective of, again, broadening the pipeline, bringing in more candidates, is that actually, something you can put in your strategy that will help get you there? Or is it more of a nice to have for this larger issue on pay?
I know Kelly was having some internet issues earlier today. Kelly, are you there with us still?
Looks like we lost her.
I don't know, Marina, if you had a follow-up, or I know we have a couple of people with hands raised. I apologize, Nicole. I know we didn't get to finish your question.
That's okay. It'll just continue to burn in my brain.
Marina, did you have a response or anything you wanted to add?
I was hoping that I think it's a great question. I was really interested in hearing what Kelly was going to say because I really could kind of go either way. I am a fan of transparency and more information, right? I feel like when you give people information, you give them an opportunity to advocate for themselves, right? Women and people of color are getting inundated with messaging around negotiate, right? So being able to have another piece of, not ammunition in an adversarial way, but, to empower yourself to be able to go into those negotiations with a reasonable number, but I do understand and I acknowledge what Kelly was starting to say around this issue of internal equity, right? So if you do have folks that are currently there are some people who have started jobs who did not negotiate their salary when they could have, right? And they may see that number and be kicking themselves like, I should have asked for more, right? But I don't think that those folks should hold back the progress of the future, right? We have to be able to kind of rectify that. And maybe there's conversations that can be had around bonuses and that type of thing to help close that gap. But we need to be able to allow people to have the information that they need to go into these negotiations empowered to ask for what they're worth. Is where I land, but I don't know if that answers your question, Nicole. I'm sorry.
No, that it does. It's more to think about in the whole decision-making process. Thank you.
It looks like I do think we have Kelly back, but I think I will open up the floor to some other questions as well. Thanks, Kelly. You're on your phone?
I'm on our electricity keeps going on and out. So
we're glad you're here. Thank you for making it. I know, Jessica, you had your hand up for a little bit. Do you want to ask your question? And then maybe we'll have time for just one or two more questions.
Yes, thank you. So this actually ties in really well with what Marina just said. But our group conversation kind of reflected on the fact that there's tons of generational knowledge that people are missing out on. So when you're coming out of high school, are you taught how to do a resume? Are you taught how to do a cover letter? Are you taught about salary negotiation? Probably not. My parents didn't talk about it, and I come from a pretty okay background. And so what about those people? Like, how do we get people even applying to the jobs if they don't know how to write competitive cover letters or resumes. And so I just wondering what your thoughts are on how to kind of fix that problem from the ground, at least from high school and beginning college. How do we kind of fix that problem to give people more of a chance, and then fix our hiring practices as well?
One thing that might be helpful, it's been really helpful for tech companies wanting to engage employees and then also make community impact, right, and help build that pipeline in the high school stages, is providing volunteer opportunities. So are there, if there's already organizations for young kids of color who want to get in the nuclear space, how can yourself and your colleagues to volunteer and help them with their resumes, help them get excited about the nuclear community? If there's not, like, what are you, can you start that, right? Can you start something like that to get people excited about getting into the industry at a young age and then setting them up for success, giving them those resume trainings? Another thing that companies have done it's even easier is create like resume templates and then put those in their job descriptions and say, like, here's a sample resume, here's what we're looking for in a resume. I think particularly in academia, this might be helpful. I've seen resumes like for data scientists, for example, where they've got like a 4-page, 5-page resume. And I'm like, I don't want to read this. But it seems like that's the standard. I think whatever the cultural norm is, whatever you're looking for in a resume, let your applicants know that that's what you're looking for so that they don't have that internal, is this the right thing? Am I going to look stupid? And kind of count themselves out before they've even applied. And then the flip side of that is if you see someone whose resume has, grammatical mistakes or doesn't look like the format that you're used to, don't hold that against them.
If I can add a quick 2-finger on that as well, echo everything that Kelly just said. And also, there are so many programs that are targeting this specific demographic, right? That are targeting early career entrance on topics like resume writing, networking, interviewing, negotiating, right? So each of us needs to take this as our personal mandate to share that information, right? I get programs that come into my inbox on the regular. Are you forwarding that, right? Or do they die in your inbox? We have to do a better job of amplifying and advertising these programs so that students and young people know that they're available to them, right? I was a direct beneficiary of programs like that, right? But it was somebody put it in front of me and told me to apply. So we need to do, take on more of a responsibility individually to advocate for those programs and amplify them.
Great, thanks. And I think we'll have time for maybe just one more question. Caitlin, I know I've seen your hand up for a little bit, if you want to ask your question.
Thank you. My name's Caitlin. It was great to see everyone on the call today. I was just wondering if our panelists could comment on basically like how sort of long-term sustained change is required to make a lot of these efforts work. I think it was you, Marina, at the beginning, you were talking about how like we have this cycle of basically, saying we want change and then doing something performative or something highly visible and it doesn't work, and then having to do the same thing again in a year or like whenever there's a horrific news story about these issues. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about like what's necessary in terms of like the fact that maybe you're going to have to make a lot of steps initially that are invisible, that aren't going to have like high visibility impact, but will actually go towards more sustained organizational and institutional change.
Kelly, do you want to take that first? I can go.
You can go.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, I want to say, hey, Caitlin and the DTR on the line, they wrote that amazing paper. I just want to shout them out. The one with the epistemic and the institutional, that was them. So kudos. So thank you so much for the question. I think what stuck out to me in the question was this idea of something public, right? And I'm seeing this even in my own work right now, right? Leadership is really interested in making a statement, being bold, making sure they're on the record, right? But not thinking about it in a long-term way, to your question. And for me, I feel like, it's gonna require an internal shift in the way that we value these issues, right? And the way that we plan and resource these issues. This is one of the challenges that we're coming up against in my own employer, right? How does your investment in diversity and inclusion efforts, whether they be externally facing or internally facing, measure up with other investments that you're making? and thinking not reactively, right, but proactively about where you want those budgets to be, right? Oftentimes something happens, like you said, in the news, and now we're putting out statements and we have to show progress. So that means that you are on the fly putting budgets together, as opposed to really thinking about what are our goals here, to Kelly's point, right? What are our goals here? What is the budget that we need to meet those goals, not on a 1-year scale, but on a 3 to 5 year scale, right? And then you put that money with that goal, and then you start to execute. And along the way, to Kelly's point, you measure and you monitor. But we don't think about diversity and inclusion like that. We don't plan for diversity and inclusion like that. But we do for other things. We do when the NGO needs money to fund operations, right? We do that all, we plan in that way. So until we're able, and I don't have the answer as to how to catalyze that shift, but until we get there, we're going to continue to be reactionary, and our progress is continually going to be short and dwarfed, right? That's kind of my view.
So we're running close on time, and I'm wondering, Kelly, do you want to chime in on this? Because I think Caitlin really asked an interesting question here.
Yeah, well, I was going to say there's nothing I can add. I think what I can add is keep that mindset, like understand that this is long-term work. Do not get discouraged. It is very, one of the participants said that she's specifically working in DEI for her group, and it's heartbreaking work. It's mad whether you're doing it full time or as just an individual who cares. Keep in mind that you are not going to see change immediately. You'll pick up some small wins, but I think having that mindset. Otherwise, a lot of people, particularly allies, right, particularly people who aren't personally affected, it's very easy to just give up on the work and say it's impossible. But it's not impossible, but it will take a long time. Well,
thank you both Marina and Kelly. This has just been a really provocative and amazing conversation. And Kelly, I think you ended the bulk of the conversation on a really important note, and that's the importance of having hope when you're just confronted with, we have a little win and then 10 losses and 2 wins and 5 losses. And I think sometimes, regardless of the arena you work in, you have to somehow aspire to rise above that and to take your work and from a sense of hopefulness. And I think what I loved about this conversation is we all have room to be accomplices here. And I hope that some of the conversation helps guide all of us to go back to our respective workplaces and say, hey, by the way, maybe we can take that one qualifying thing out of this posting we just posted because it excludes people inappropriately. So I hope everybody will go back with a feeling of, gee, I have some new tools in my arsenal here, and I'm gonna find ways to use them. And Sarah, I'm gonna turn it over to you because I know you're probably like, okay, time's up.
Oh yeah, I was like that 3 minutes ago. But honestly, thank you so much, Kelly and Marina. You guys were fantastic, as we knew you would be. Thank you. I also want to say a big thank you to everyone that showed up and engaged with us. We really appreciate it. And Brittany, I'm so sorry I didn't say hello. I didn't introduce you at the beginning. Huge thanks to Brittany, our tech producer over at Tech Change. Really, really appreciate it. We will share the recording with this when it's done sometime next week, and you are welcome to send it to your colleagues and to your friends. And stay tuned for our next nuclear mixer. I think we're going to be doing that on April 8th. So do stay tuned. Thank you so much, Kelly and Marina. Again, seriously, huge thanks. And I wish I could give you a standing ovation, but imagine I am. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your evenings and your afternoons, and we will see you all very soon.
Thank you
all.
Bye-bye. Good seeing everybody. Thanks.
You too. Bye.
Bye, guys.